everyone. Well, today you have two stories for the price of one. But the first story isn't from the Bible at all. Do you know who this is? Maybe you recognize him. His name is Geppetto, and he is a wood carver. And do you have any idea what he carved? He carved Pinocchio. Now, I bet you know the story of Pinocchio. Pinocchio was a little puppet, and when Geppetto carved him, he made him a puppet with strings. But Geppetto didn't want Pinocchio just to be a puppet with strings. He wished and wished that Pinocchio could be a real boy. But he woke up one morning and Pinocchio had been made into a puppet with no strings. So he was nearly a real boy, but he was still made of wood. Geppetto asked Pinocchio if he would be a good boy, because if he was good, he might become a real boy. So the first morning that Pinocchio was a little wooden boy with no strings, Geppetto sent him off to school. And I bet you know what happened next. Pinocchio wasn't a good boy all the time, was he? In fact, Pinocchio learned to do something that made his nose grow longer and longer and longer. Pinocchio learned to tell lies. And even though his nose grew as long as you can see in that last picture so that birds could actually perch on the end of it, it took a long time for Pinocchio to realize what being good was. But when he finally realized how he could be good, he went back to Geppetto. He found Geppetto, who had been searching and searching for him, and he was probably a little bit worried that Geppetto wouldn't forgive him and wouldn't love him. But of course, Geppetto did love him. He had searched and searched for him when he'd run away, and he was so happy to find Pinocchio again that he gave him a huge hug. And because he was loved, and he loved Geppetto, and he had learned to be good, Pinocchio wasn't a wooden puppet anymore with no strings. Oh no. Pinocchio became a real boy. And Geppetto and Pinocchio could love one another forever. Now, what do you think the story of Pinocchio might have to do with our hero from last week? Do you remember who our hero was from last week? It was little Samuel. And funnily enough, today's story has another little person in it. It's not Samuel, because Samuel is properly grown up now. And we have to go to a very different part of Samuel's story before we get to the smaller person. Lots of clues. What can it be about? Okay, you ready to sit back? And we'll have the story of Samuel and Saul and we might have to wait till the end of the story to find out who the "and" is. Okay? So, our story begins with Samuel doing as God asks. Samuel had been God's servant for a long time, and Samuel had been told by God to find Saul and anoint him to be king. And that's exactly what he did. He found Saul, and you can see him pouring special oil over Saul's head. But unfortunately, Saul didn't stay being a good king or following what God said. He became proud and obstinate. He wanted his own way, and he didn't obey God, and he didn't listen to Samuel. Samuel looked so disappointed. Could God and Samuel have got it wrong? What do you think? Of course not. God never gets anything wrong. Let's think again of the beginning of Samuel's story. Do you remember Hannah and her husband? Hannah and her husband were quite old by now, because that person in the middle, well, that's Samuel, all grown up. But
Who is that? Elsewhere in the kingdom, growing up. You see, when Samuel first came to the temple, do you remember? He was just a little boy. And when Samuel first learned to follow God, he was just a little boy. Remember how he heard God talking to him in the temple? Well, Samuel went off to visit Jesse. Can you recognize him from the last picture? There's Jesse. That's the dad. And Jesse had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Well, maybe he had 5 sons. Tall, handsome, very strong, really special sons. And Samuel knew that God had told him to go to see Jesse. So when he arrived, he looked at the tall, handsome, very strong, very clever sons. And he thought, this one of these is going to make a very good replacement for Saul, who isn't looking after his people and isn't listening to my God anymore. So which one do you think he's going to pick? Is it going to be the one in the orange? Or is it going to be the one with the blue coat? Or is it going to be the one with the green coat at the back? Well, the answer is none of those. Samuel walked down the line and he could hear God saying, no, not this one. No, not this one. No, not this one. No, not even this one. No, this one's very, very good, but it's not who I've chosen to be the next king, said Samuel. Who comes next? There's nobody. Jesse, have you got another son somewhere? Oh, yes, said Jesse, I do. I have another son. His name is David, and he's out with the sheep. If you hold on, you might be able to see him. So Samuel waited, and along came a very young boy. I wonder if Samuel thought, I was a very young boy when God managed to use me. I wonder if that's why this young boy is so special. He doesn't look like a superhero. He just looks like an ordinary person. But I suppose God knows best. And so, can you see in Samuel's hand, he had the special horn that had oil in it that anointed the new kings. And so there and then, what do you think Samuel did? Samuel anointed David to be the new king. Not immediately, because Saul was still the king. But what it meant was that David was going to be the next king. Now, God said something very special to Samuel, and this is what he said. Man looks on the outside. God looks on the heart. You see, people might have looked at David and thought he was just a little boy and had no chance of being a superhero. But God had looked into the heart of David, and he knew he had a wonderful heart, a heart that followed him and a heart that loved him. Now, when God told Samuel to anoint Saul king, God could see the heart of Saul, and Saul had a good heart. But just like Geppetto didn't want to have a puppet with strings, God didn't want to make Saul a puppet that he just pulled about. What he wanted to do was to let Saul choose what was good and what was bad. And so he didn't make him do things. He told him what was the best thing to do. He told him through Samuel. But Saul could make his own mind up. Saul could choose to be good or to be bad. And I'm afraid, even though God could see that Saul had had a good heart, Saul let his heart get hard and he stopped listening to God. And God was so sad. And that sometimes happens. But you know, God is always, always ready. Just like that story of Pinocchio. Always ready to forgive. He goes on searching for everybody. Even those people who think that they don't want to know God. God is always there waiting to have them back, to love them and to forgive them. Just like Pinocchio when he came back to Geppetto. Geppetto loved him and hugged him and held him close to his heart. So just remember that man looks on the outside. People look at what you look like on the outside. But God always looks in your heart and can see the very best that you can be. And that's what he loves. But he'll never make you do things. He only ever asks and waits. How lovely to be able to make our own minds up to love God.